names. And John Bonham and Jimmy Page played in Roy Harper's backing band on the 14th of February 74 at the Rainbow in London, and they called the band the Intergalactic Elephant Band.
What a name.
Wow, I think that has got to be up there with the best ever name creations. But Jimmy Page did quite well in himself. He featured on Roy Harper's 1971 album Stormcock, and for contractual reasons he couldn't be listed as Jimmy Page. He's listed as S. Flavius Mercurius. Absolutely.
And that's because he was under contract and couldn't actually use his surname, right?
I guess so, yeah. Yeah, because he was very much under contracted then. But I mean, Harrison did a similar sort of thing as well. He was credited on a number of albums under a nom de plume or various nom de plumes. But more about Aleister Crowley. He just pops up all over the place. And Led Zeppelin, they around 76, they had a movie released a movie called "The Song Remains the Same," where each of them did a fantasy sequence, and Jimmy Page chose to do his near Loch Ness at Boleskine House, which is where he lived. And Boleskine House he actually bought from Aleister Crowley in 1971. So obviously that relationship carries on.
So he was deeply infatuated or interested in Aleister Crowley.
Oh, very much. Yeah, very much. And also, interestingly enough, David Bowie makes reference to him in a track called Quicksand on Hunky Dory. He refers to Aleister Crowley and the Golden Pond, and the Golden Dawn. And what he says is, "I'm closer to the Golden Dawn, immersed in Crowley's uniform of imagery." Golden Dawn was a society in the late 18th, early 19th centuries that studied the occult. By about the 1930s, I think it more or less petered out. But you can imagine that David Bowie would find himself interested in this whole sort of area.
Yeah, we've spoken about the Knights of the Golden Dawn on our show in the past.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
So Aleister Crowley's all over, and David Bowie himself, if you watch a lot of his music videos, you can see that he has a lot of occult symbolism throughout the videos.
Yeah.
He was deeply into that as well.
Yeah. And even the Beatles crop up on the Aleister Crowley story, because if you look at the Sgt. Pepper album, and as everybody knows, that's the one with all the various celebrities in a collage on the front cover. Aleister Crowley pops up at the top left-hand corner. He's the bald guy at the top left-hand corner of the sleeve, and apparently it was Paul that picked Aleister Crowley out to appear on the cover.
Oh, the apparent dead man who wasn't dead.
Well, exactly. I mean, the sort of linking to the later Beatles story, it's really quite interesting how associations of death pop up in the Beatles story all over the place. And fortunately, there's somebody on tour to enable the Led Zeppelin people to pop into this particular edition, and that's Robert Plant. And he's got a UK tour running from the 16th of November through to the 12th of December. So an opportunity to see him on the road.
Yeah, and I would love to have a chance of seeing him, but you said that's only in the UK, correct?
Yeah, that particular tour only visits the UK.
Well, that's all right. He wants to play for the UK crowd. That's hometown for him, isn't it, basically?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, though, is that's the sort of opposite of how a lot of Led Zeppelin's was, because they weren't finding much success in the UK. They chose to go off to America to start their career, and they found fame from there. And in the UK, they had a policy of not releasing singles because they felt they were an albums band. But in the US, they released a bunch of singles. So it's quite interesting, really. And most of the albums were released a lot of the albums were released in the America before they were released in the UK.
Well, they had a little bit. I mean, a couple of their albums were very Americana style music, so I could see why they would play well here versus back in the UK or other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. But already referred to the Beatles. Now the Beatles have got a few Halloween associated things. It was really Halloween 1963 that broke the Beatles in America. They were returning from their first ever foreign tour, which wasn't Germany, and from Sweden, and they were at Heathrow Airport, and there were hundreds of, which was quite a lot in those days, hundreds of screaming fans at the airport, and Ed Sullivan just happened to be changing planes at the same time and saw all this going on at the airport, asked what it was all about, told that the mop-top Beatles were the best thing since sliced bread, and he decided that he'd invite them over onto his show. And 4 months later, around February I think it was, they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the rest, as they say, is history. And
just by chance, he was at the airport at the same time when they arrived?
Pure coincidence. He didn't really know. Well, he didn't know who they were, because at that stage, I mean, they were starting to branch out. But that was Sweden was their first venture outside British waters, apart from Hamburg, of course. And they were massive in the UK. By the end of 1963, they really were picking up a serious head of steam in the UK. And I think they did appear on TV before Ed Sullivan, briefly. And the other thing, of course, was that Capitol Records didn't pick up their option, because the Parlophone EMI, the UK label, their sister company in America was Capitol, and George Martin offered them the songs, but they didn't think that the Beatles were going to sell, which is why the first album and first bunch of singles were actually on VJ and Swan, until Capitol decided that around the time of the Ed Sullivan show, around the December, January, they picked up their option. I Want to Hold Your Hand, I think, was the first American hit, and it just went from strength to strength, led to the British invasion, and the Beatles becoming a legend, really, I guess.
Sure. And when did they start their own label?
That would have been about 66, 7.
Okay.
I can't remember the first one that was on that.
And that was they were popular enough where they said, we're just going to do our own stuff and forget about it, having the record company dictate things to them.
Oh, absolutely. But they did venture with Apple. They did venture into the clothes business as well. They opened a store in Baker Street in London. But that was a complete disaster, because they had no interest whatsoever in making money. I mean, the business just absolutely hemorrhaged money. And I think Alan Klein was managing them by then. And he wasn't a man to throw money around. And he very much closed the whole business down.
Which was a nightmare for them.
Oh, absolutely. Well, they just lost a fortune, but they weren't really that interested. If you think of the culture of the 60s, money was a very uncool kind of thing. It was uncool to be into money, particularly. And the whole idea of the Apple label was to bring on other new acts and help them. It was very sort of humanitarian kind of business. They wanted to put back into the music world, as it were. Interestingly enough, by Halloween 1969, on Halloween in the UK, they released the singles "Something" and "Come Together," which was sort of good news and bad news. It was really good news for George Harrison, because that was the only song, certainly in the UK, that was issued as a Beatles A-side, and it's the most covered song after Yesterday of the sort of songs to come from that area. And in the UK, it's just as a matter of interest, it was the only UK time that album tracks were used as a single. I know that was very much different in America, because up until Sgt. Pepper, the album releases were all different. Even the ones that had the same name had different tracks.
And Come Together was the B-side?
Come Together, yeah. Now that was the sort of bad news of the good news and bad news. Bad news for John Lennon. It's credited to Lennon McCartney, but he essentially wrote it. And Chuck Berry's publisher, Morris Levy, sued Lennon for plagiarism for Come Together, because he reckoned that, well, he didn't just reckon. I mean, Lennon had slightly lifted a line from Berry's You Can't Catch Me. And what Lennon sang was, here come old flat top, he come grooving up slowly. And what Berry had been playing along to some years earlier was, here come a flat top, he was moving up with me. And that was enough for a major plagiarism lawsuit. I mean, it's a really long story, all this, because the way Lennon got around it is he agreed to include a couple of Chuck Berry songs on his on an album. And he chose Rock and Roll, and Rock and Roll was the 1975 album he was making with Phil Spector. And there's quite a big story about how all that panned out. And he did end up including You Can't Catch Me, his version of it, and Sweet Little 16 on his Rock and Roll album. So Chuck Berry finally got royalties, as it were, from what would obviously John Lennon would be a big selling album.
All right, folks, we're up against our half-hour break. But don't go anywhere. More of Derek Shelmerdine and Rock and Roll Unraveled on the flip side of this. Smoke 'em if you got 'em.
Because the John LeBang Show will be right back
After this. That's guaranteed. Yes. CRRM, CarePoint Billing Services. Their billers and managers are all dedicated to working for you to increase your profits. For more information, call CRRM at 248-579-3805. CRRM, CarePoint Billing Services.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
Forces of darkness, the treasonable Mayans who collaborate, must, can, and will be wiped from the face of the earth.
Boy, the rap artists of today wouldn't be able to do anything with those kind of standards.
Absolutely. On the Spooky Beatles side, when they were putting the whole anthology thing together, obviously John Lennon had died some years earlier. They were outside doing a photo shot around the time they were recording Free as a Bird. And there's this photograph of the three of them standing outside by a tree, and a very rare white peacock walking behind them at the back of the shot. And Paul believed that it was very much John Lennon signalling his sign of approval for the project.
Right, and Free as a Bird was done much later.
That's right. Yeah, it was a song that Lennon had recorded. There was a sort of not really a test pressing, just an early recording of it. And what they did, they sort of dubbed themselves across onto that song. So it was the four of them. But if you think back to the interesting attachment there is that if you think back to the Abbey Road album, John's the one in the front of the four of them walking across the zebra crossing in a white suit. So you can very much see the reason why Paul might think it was John looking down on them and saying,
sure,
hey,
and they
guys,
were playing the Dead Paul thing on that album cover as well. They were playing off on that.
Yeah, that's very much part of the Paul is Dead thing. There's a Volkswagen Beetle parked just behind them in the shot, and it's got the registration 28 if, which would have been his age if he'd lived. And there's a lot of things on the Pepper album as well, supporting conspiracy theorists about Paul's demise.
Sure, and they even dabbled. They've got Helter Skelter, which was kind of a weird, crazy little tune in itself, where it kind of dabbled into some weird stuff.
That's right, yeah. And that was picked up by Manson, of course.
Mm-hmm. And then, Number 9. Number 9. I mean, you listen to that for a while, that gets a little freaky.
Yeah, it's no wonder that the Beatles are still considered to be the greatest band of all time. I mean,